Boom. Welcome to the Omniverse Comics Guide bonus section. I can't let you go without talking about the Hobgoblin because it's
Okay.
this character of the 80s that, every decade has that villain that kind of signifies the decade. And I think the Hobgoblin was the one that ran through with this mystery. Nobody knew about it.
Hmm.
It ended controversially. Nobody believed that Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin, even when they revealed that. But when you guys get on the book and inherit this storyline that Roger starts, that's, everybody's intrigued by. And he almost feels more threatening because he's a gangster mobster, not just the crazy industrialist that knows a secret.
Right.
This guy's out, he's got a plan, and what's he connected to? So,
Yeah.
how much did you guys know about the Hobgoblin going into it? How much did Roger share with you? And did you guys have a direction that you were going either way with the character? If it was up
Yes.
to you guys, please
Yes.
indulge.
All of that. Here's the deal. You know, when you inherit characters like that, you try to tread softly on things that have been pre-established and prior creators. We
Absolutely.
went through it later. We went through it with Thor with Beta Ray Bill. We stayed away from Beta Ray Bill for years because that was Walt's thing, and we didn't want to step on anything. And we kind of waited around to see if Walt wanted, if he had anything more to say about the character. And then when we did use Beta Ray Bill, we just used him very respectfully, and he served a purpose in the story, and we moved on. So it was the same kind of thing with Hobgoblin. We had to deal with Hobgoblin because he was still active. So we didn't have the option of ignoring Hobgoblin.
Right.
And early on, I had a conversation with Tom, and I said, "Did Roger tell you who the Hobgoblin was?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Okay, who is it?" And he said, we're not going to do it." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." Because Tom was the editor on a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And it's no secret. Roger's plan was to set up the twin brother thing. Um, of course, Roger's idea was that Daniel Kingsley and Roderick Kingsley.
That's right.
Okay. And his plan was that he had already shown enough of the Kingsleys that uh, sometimes he would be kind of cowardly and cravenly, which was Daniel, and other times he would be more calculating and cruel, and that was
Yes,
Roderick,
that's
right? And he
true.
was slowly building this thing where occasionally you would see the character in Peter Parker, some of those wonderful stories that Marie Severin drew and all that kind of stuff, and you'd go like, "Wow, he's being a badass," or "He's being he's being a coward. What's going on?" So that was Roger's plan. That was a slow build Roger's plan.
Interesting.
Unfortunately, as Roger's editor, Tom didn't feel that that was there for
Mm,
the reader. There was enough of that there for the reader to have, because you always want the reader to have, hopefully you give them enough clues that when you finally reveal it, that the reader feels like you played fair.
true.
That the reader doesn't feel like you just jerk their chain. Okay.
Right, right.
So at that point, Tom was kind of feeling like, it wouldn't have been playing fair so we weren't planning on revealing it anytime soon, but he, and again, Roger, God love him. I love Roger personally, and I'm a big fan, but Roger will even argue that they're not twins. They're just very close in age. And yet they're similar looking enough that they can play each
Each other.
other,
Okay.
that kind of thing,
Yeah, that doesn't
which,
work as well.
you know,
Twins
that,
works.
that Daniel can put on a wig
Yeah, yeah.
and show up at the office and be Roderick. And it's like, I mean, come on.
Yeah.
We've seen twins do it. I mean,
Yeah. I fall for it.
I've heard story after story. There was even a set of female twins in my high school that used to switch,
Classes.
trade classes and play with the teachers and all that kind of stuff. So you can believe it to a degree with twins,
Absolutely.
but if they're not twins, that becomes even a harder sell, right?
Yeah.
So Tom and I, he wasn't being mean to Roger. He was just being kind of dismissive. I said, "Well, who did Roger mean for it to be?" And he goes, it was going to be Roderick Kingsley's evil twin, which is incorrect. It was going to be Daniel Kingsley's evil twin, and they weren't supposed to be twins. So, but Tom said, we're not going to do the evil twin thing. I said, okay. So we talked about a lot of different possibilities, and they were reflected in our suspects. You know, we had the cop Keating was a suspect. Ned Leeds was a suspect. We had Lance Bannon as a suspect. We had our share of suspects.
I could have saw Lance Bannon. That kind of was working.
Yeah, Lance Bannon was one of the suspects. So, you know, Tom was building his mystery, and he was lining up a bunch of possible suspects. What was going on at the time, unfortunately, was that our editor at the time had a fairly combative relationship with his writers. And Tom didn't trust our editor to keep anything a secret. So he was comfortable with the editor thinking that we were leaning towards Ned Leeds. Okay. But what ended up happening, since Tom didn't want to tell the editor who we were shooting for, Tom kept adding scenes with this other suspect. The editor kept cutting those scenes out because he didn't understand why that character was there, because Tom didn't tell him he's a suspect. This was Kingpin's son, Richard Fisk.
That would have been beautiful too.
Okay. The guy had been the schemer in the early stories and all that kind of stuff. Do you remember that character?
Yeah. It would have made perfect sense.
Richard Fisk was a character that Tom wanted to bring him in, and he was going to throw him in amongst all the other suspects. And there was like a scene at that big businessmen's club where when the Hobgoblin saw the Kingpin, he kind of froze and showed deference and respect to the Kingpin. And Tom was thinking, that would be cool if that was Richard Fisk, you know, if he had created this. That's why the guy who discovered the cache of weapons contacted Richard Fisk, because he had connections to the underworld. He was a rich guy who had connections to the underworld. Richard decided this was he could make a play to be Kingpin of crime, and became Hobgoblin. But that was the problem. Every time he would try to add a scene with Richard Fisk in it, the editor would cut it out because it was extra stuff that we didn't need. And Tom was not willing to tell him, well, but he's one of our suspects. I want him in there because I want him to be one of our suspects.
Right.
So they kind of
butt heads on it.
It wasn't working. Okay?
Yeah.
It wasn't working. Now, ultimately, we were fired from the title anyway.
Yeah.
And by the time we were fired, the editor then went to Peter David and said, I'm killing Ned Leeds in the Spider-Man Wolverine story. And Peter David's reaction, because he had been writing the Peter Parker book, was, how can you kill Ned Leeds? That seems to be who DeFalco is pointing towards as the Hobgoblin. And he goes, yeah, it's going to throw a wrench in the works. It'll make everybody doubt what's going on. You know, it might piss off DeFalco, but it'll be great. It'll be great. So, and then he said, and your job is to tell me, now that DeFalco's gone, who is the Hobgoblin? Now, Peter David has been interviewed about this, and Peter David looked over all of our comics, looked over all the stories, and said, it's got to be Ned Leeds. I mean, all the clues pointed to Ned Leeds. And now, and he's not wrong, but because Ned was going through, you know, Flash was going through the thing with Shashan, and there were some comments that Hobgoblin made to Shashan that sounded like, you know, a cruel ex-lover, and there were, you know, so there were other suspects, but Peter tried to do the best job he could with what he was given that Ned Leeds was now dead. He came up with a twist that, no, Ned Leeds was the Hobgoblin. He was killed, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And he goes, so I'm thinking it still has to be Ned Leeds. And apparently the editor said to Peter David at one point, well, I think Hobgoblin should be the foreigner. which was one of the characters that Peter David had introduced, who was like the ex-husband of Silver Sable, and he was like an international criminal and all this kind of stuff, right? And Peter David said, no, no, there's no way the foreigner is Hobgoblin. Why would the foreigner be Hobgoblin? And he goes, well, if you don't want it to be the foreigner, then you come up with who it has to be. And that's when Peter David looked at everything and said, it's got to be Ned Leeds. So he decided to tell this story where in flashback, you see Ned Leeds as the Hobgoblin get killed by assassins who were hired by Jack-o'-lantern, who became the new Hobgoblin.
Not Jason
Do you remember what the
Macendale.
character's name was?
Jason
There you go.
Macendale? Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. So that's how all of that came about, because Peter felt he was completely hedged in, and he doing the best he could with what he was given at the time. He said, we're going to do this thing with, and the editor said, yeah, okay, that I don't care. That works fine. So they did the whole flashback of Ned was the Hobgoblin. Ned was killed by these assassins, all this kind of stuff. Now, the problem with that was all the things that Roger pointed out when he finally did Hobgoblin Lives. Because almost immediately after that story,
Yeah, I just
Roger
finished reading that.
Roger contacted the Marvel editors, whoever were in charge of those things at the time, and said, there's more to the story. There's no way those assassins could have taken out the Hobgoblin that way. So we could tell more stories with Hobgoblin. Unfortunately, DeFalco was editor-in-chief at the time, and he wanted it all to just go away. He was so disappointed in how the whole Hobgoblin thing ended that he just said, Roger, I think it may be too late. Let's just leave it alone. But a couple of years later, Tom Brevoort and mostly Glenn Greenberg, who was a young associate editor at the time, who was a huge Roger Stern fan, huge Hobgoblin fan, he went, this guy may be handing us a piece of solid gold here. We should do this. And they first approached John Romita Jr., and he was too busy with the regular Spider-Man books. I forget what I was doing at the time. I might have even been working on Superman. There were one or two projects that I actually asked for permission while I was on Superman, on contract with Superman, to do some extra work. And that might have been one of them. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it was around the same time.
But yeah, it was around that time. So anyway, but I was flattered that they approached me, and they sent me the plot, and I was talking to DeFalco about it, and DeFalco said, Ron, I don't know, Ron, this seems like so much time has passed, and blah, blah, blah. And I said, Tom, I understand what you're saying, but I just read the plot, and it works. I mean, it's like a nice separate movie where Roger reintroduces all the suspects from back in his stories without making a big deal about it, or without you having to read those old stories. He gives you all the suspects. Pete and Mary Jane are now married. He comes to a realization. Betty Brant was the entree character because she had become a reporter for Jameson, and Macendale was going to trial, and he decided, to throw a wrench into his own work that would make the trial go on for longer and everything. He threw out the fact that he wasn't the first Hobgoblin, and there were other Hobgoblins, and now this will all have to be retried in court and blah blah blah. And it was a wonderful, wonderful little story with intrigue and all kinds of stuff, and it gave Roger an opportunity to
finish the story,
take the story back to his original idea of the two brothers and reestablishing that, and it was wonderful. And I was really happy to help Roger reclaim his character, and I thought it made it a much stronger character, because the character had just been watered down by people who didn't care as much about the character as Roger did. I don't believe that was Tom and I. Tom and I were trying to make it something. I mean, we love the character. We were just concerned with making him scary and making him a threat. And that was his main purpose in all the stories we were telling,
You built upon it wonderfully. So it was good that you got to finish that story with Roger.
I was really happy to be a part of it. Yeah. And it worked out great. Roger seemed to be happy with it. And that scene where Pete reacts to wait a minute, the way they talk about, because he finally saw the file of how Med was killed, and he's going, but he had super strength. I know he took the goblin goo and he had super strength. I fought the guy enough times to
Yeah,
know he had
yeah.
super strength. There's no way that a bunch of regular assassins could have taken this guy out. He would have turned him into paste. And he begins to suspect, and Betty Brant begins to have her own suspicions. And it was just a really terrific story. It was wonderful to be a part of it. Originally, George Perez was supposed to ink the entire thing,
Mm.
but he was overcommitted to all these other big projects he was doing,
Yeah.
so he had to bow out. He inked the 3 covers and he inked the first issue, and then the second issue, a couple of different people came in to help out, and then Bob McLeod came in on the third. But overall, I mean, it was a neat story to be a part of, and I was glad. We ended up finally bringing Hobgoblin into Spider Girl, and dealt with Roderick and Daniel and how scary this guy was. And it was basically, the Hobgoblin comes to Mr. Rogers' neighborhood and starts breaking people, that kind of thing. So it was a lot of fun to play out the Hobgoblin story in Spider Girl. The fans were interesting because there was this one guy I was talking to at a convention. He was a huge Hobgoblin fan, and just like you, he wanted to hear some of the behind the scenes stuff and everything. And at the time, it was when we were bringing Hobgoblin into Spider Girl. And he was talking about how much he loved what DeFalco and I did with Hobgoblin. And I told him, well, we're doing them in Spider Girl again. So you might want to pick up, the current issues of Spider Girl. And he went, Spider Girl? But that's not real Marvel, right? And I said, yeah. I mean, it's an alternate future thing, but
Yeah.
it's DeFalco and me doing Hobgoblin, and it's Kingsley and all that kind of stuff. And he went, oh, okay. Well, I'll think about it. But anyway, it was good talking to you. Bye. And he left, and I went, wow, okay,
The
whatever.
loyalty. I know. That's funny.
But well, he's loyal to Hobgoblin. That's all that's
Yeah, that's
important.
for sure.
But I was really happy handling the character again. I think it's a really cool character. But anyway, that's the story. That was there is an issue of Back Issue Magazine, tomorrow's publications, and Glenn Greenberg did a comprehensive article where he interviewed all the principals, and he interviewed the editor by using the editor's blog as his testimony. The editor didn't want to be interviewed, but he used his blog entries as his testimony. And he
Mm.
interviewed Peter David, and he interviewed Jim Shooter, and he interviewed Tom DeFalco, and he interviewed Glenn. But Glenn did this comprehensive interview thing, and it is the full story. It's called when Spidey met Hobby, or when Hobby met Spidey, or something like that. But
That's
it's
cool.
the whole backstory on the whole mess. And it was a shame. And it is so rare in any kind of collaborative field like comics for the original creator to get a chance to
Yeah.
come back
Yeah.
and polish up that turd that his character was turned
Another
into,
yeah,
that.
another character has that second like it I feel
Yeah.
that story is quintessential now. Like it is important. It's a good
Well,
ending
I
to the
mean, they've
story.
they've gone and done all kinds of different things
Yeah,
with the Hobgoblin.
that's
But,
fine.
what are you going to do? What are you going to do? I understand that the Puma, Thomas Fireheart, has gone through some very, very tough times in the last 30 years since we did him back in the day. So, who knows? Maybe someday Tom and I will get a chance to revisit Thomas Fireheart and bring him back to our standards. But it's crazy. You don't usually get that kind of an opportunity. So it was very rare for Roger to get that, and it was mostly thanks to Glenn Greenberg, and so he was the right guy to do all those interviews too. So that's the
Perfect.
story. Did I answer your question?
100% thank you.
Okay. Welcome.
I'll
You're
let you
welcome.
go now.
And just as a little side thing that you don't need to use at all. Remember, I said that Tom DeFalco actually played the unfamiliar role of kind of the bad guy because he said, Ron, I think too much time has passed, and I don't think anybody really cares about that storyline anymore. So I don't begrudge Roger trying to get it done, but I'm just not sure. I think too much time has passed, right? All these years have now passed since Hobgoblin lives, and this 10-page story that Tom and I just did with the Thing, uh, touches back on something that Tom did decades ago. Do you remember Tom's Marvel 2-in-1 story where the Thing and Sandman sit down and have a beer
I do not.
and just talk about the Sandman's career and how he's always getting his head handed to him by superheroes and he's getting sick and tired of getting beat up all the time? And it actually started Sandman on a path to redemption way back in the day. And he actually ended up becoming one of Silver Sable's operatives for a while in the Silver Sable book. You know, Tom had kind of started Sandman on this path to redemption. And John Byrne came in and was doing some different stories where he had the wizard use his mind control machine and turn Sandman evil again, and kind of blew all that out of the water. And Sandman just became a bad guy again. This 10-page story we're doing, it doesn't violate any of the stuff that's happened since. But Tom decided if he was going to have a chance to touch back with Ben Grimm, he wanted to do a story where Ben Grimm runs into the Sandman again, and kind of starts playing with the idea that behind the scenes they've maintained a friendship, they've maintained a relationship. Okay, and I took great pleasure in calling Tom out and saying, you know, Tom, after being the guy who said too much time had passed and we shouldn't touch back on Hobgoblin, and not that I begrudge Roger that, but I think maybe too much time has passed. Here you are, 30 years after a bit of continuity that you started back in the day kind of got blown out of the water. Here you are doing a story that calls back all that wonderful feeling and reestablish this whole thing out there into the universe. And he goes, yeah, I know. I said,
Gotcha.
you,
You.
you,
Gotcha.
you. But
Oh,
it's a
that's
fun,
great.
and I say that by way of, it's a really fun story. I'm really looking forward to everybody getting a chance to see it in July. I hope a lot of people buy those, these 4-issue thing and get a big kick out of it.
Yeah, here's hoping. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure to hang out with you. It's like having a beer at the pub with a friend.
And,
So, all the
well, I
best.
appreciate that.